tell what kind of car this is. Probably even a non-car person could tell that this is probably a 1970s or 1980s American car. And maybe someone a little bit more familiar or who cared a little more could see the Cadillac badge on the grille with the stand-up hood ornament. You know this is probably a 1970s or 1980s era Cadillac. But something to, and I guess maybe the real hard question here is, what model Cadillac is this? And this may be kind of a cheap shot here to identify the real model of this car. It doesn't really look totally different than any other Cadillac model at the time, at least not from this angle. But the real story of this car doesn't have so much to do with the front, but has a lot more to do with the back. We can see here, and this rear has really been the point of contention for this car, really for almost half a century now. It's been basically what the public is focused on, and honestly, any member of the public, even somebody who's not familiar with cars, could take one look at this and know that this is a Cadillac Seville. Now specifically, this is a 1980 to 1985 model Seville, which followed on the success of the 1976 to 1979 Seville, which was really a home run for Cadillac. It introduced a smaller car at a higher price point than they had previously offered. And this car, in spite of looking completely different and maybe being of a totally different philosophy than the prior 76 to 79 model, really hope to, I guess, imitate the same level of success in introducing a new type of car that would fill a new spot in Cadillac's lineup. This was the first front-wheel drive Seville. It was on the Eldorado E-body platform, though it's called K-body for the Seville. There really are basically no changes in the platform, the chassis itself. This is also the first body-on-frame Seville. The prior generation Seville used a semi-unibody design shared with the Chevy Nova. So the Seville was kind of an interesting car in that it went from a unibody rear-wheel drive car to a body-on-frame front-wheel drive car. Subsequent generations would then transfer to back to a unitary body, keeping the front-wheel drive. And if you wanted to call the final STS model a Seville, though it was never called a Seville, the car would actually transition back to rear-wheel drive and a unitized platform. So there are a number of design quirks and operational features of this car that are a little strange by maybe the modern world. But they really are I would say maybe greater than the sum of their parts. Definitely more than the design gives them credit for. These were seen as maybe somewhat in poor taste or gaudy or other such things. I really don't think that's the case. I mean, design is subjective. But what really gets ignored with this car is the fact that it really was a technological advancement for Cadillac. While this chassis was introduced for the 1979 model year Eldorado, this was Cadillac's first front-wheel drive sedan, which would become their bread and butter for the next probably 3 or 4 decades after producing this car. This car has 4-wheel independent suspension, fuel injection, four-wheel disc brakes. They don't handle poorly. I would say that they handled fairly well for the time. They're extremely comfortable. They have decent interior volume. These are not big cars, and contrary to maybe popular opinion, or they're not heavy either. This car weighs probably about 36 or 3,700 pounds, which puts it about in the neighborhood of a modern day compact crossover. So they're not super heavy. They do have a nice ride. They're pretty narrow. This car is only about 70 inches wide at the widest point, I believe 69 to 70 inches. It shares its length with the 1976 to 1979 model. I think the 76 to 79 might be an inch or maybe two longer, but basically the same dimensions as the prior generation. However, Cadillac was able to get a lot better interior volume with this front-wheel drive body-on-frame setup that allowed for a completely flat floor, or almost completely flat, no transmission tunnel, and no tunnel for the exhaust or other plumbing that was common in the unibody cars, made necessary for structural rigidity and other such things. So these cars were powered by a number of different engines. The inaugural 1980 model year was actually powered by a standard diesel engine, although gas engines were available at a no-cost option. In 1981, they would be outfitted with Cadillac's V8 6.4, 6-liter variable displacement engine, which was a design derivative of their big block engine that was cut down to about 6 liters at that time from a high of 8.2 liters. The diesel engine, of course, remained optional throughout the run of this car. In 1981, a Buick-sourced 4.1-liter V6, and I'm sorry, also in the 1980 model year, a Buick-sourced V6 4.1-liter with a 4-barrel carburetor was made available as a credit option between 1980 and 1982. And in 1982, the standard engine became what this car is equipped with, the Cadillac 4.1-liter HT4100 fuel-injected V8. This is an aluminum block engine. It was Cadillac's first aluminum engine. It has cast iron heads, an aluminum intake manifold, and is of a very small and lightweight design. In 1982, also introduced a 4-speed automatic overdrive transmission, whereas the 1980 and 1981 models were only fitted with a 3-speed automatic. This 4-speed auto also had a lock-up torque converter that was not fitted to the 1980 to 1981 models. While none of these cars are really fast, I would say, especially the 82 to 85 models, with the overdrive, you can definitely drive on the highway with these, really no problems. You're able to achieve 75, 80 miles an hour all day long. And especially with these 82 to 85 models, you can actually get fairly decent gas mileage. I would say city mileage would probably be in the mid to upper teens, highway mileage in the mid to upper 20s, which really, given the design of this car, the lack of aerodynamic styling. Now, the Seville was a bit more aerodynamic than its sister car, the Eldorado, given the shorter, higher rear deck, the raked C-pillar, they are slow, by modern standards at least. By the standards of the time, they were, I would guess, fairly competitive with the other vehicles that were produced of the era. We have to remember this was the late 1970s, early 1980s. Performance was really not something that was offered in these cars, really, of any mark. We'll take a look under the hood. see here the 4.1 liter V8 engine. This one is running, in spite of many naysayers out there. What's interesting about these cars is when introduced for 1980 with the standard diesel engine, the weight of this car was over 4,000 pounds. It was not a lightweight car in 1980. The gasoline engine cut down the weight somewhat in 1980. And throughout the run, there were some weight savings made. These cars are probably best described as like analogous, I would say, to maybe a G-body, which are definitely more popular than them. Maybe a front-wheel drive version of the G-body. Similar size, similar weight. The sheet metal on these cars is pretty thin, actually. Helps to keep the weight down. Unfortunately, that does mean that they are susceptible, extremely susceptible, to paint checking on the upper surfaces, especially the hood and the deck lid, where the metal is pretty thin. These cars were all painted with lacquer paint throughout the run from 1980 to 1985. Clear coat wouldn't appear for the Seville until 1986, when the car was downsized to a different platform. You can see that this paint is still in good shape. There's no spider cracking on it, as is common with these. You see here the lamp monitors, which provide you an indicator for your turn signal, low beam, high beam. These are fiber optic cables that run to each one of the lamps in front. So this way you can see if you have it all out. It's also repeated in the rear window. Can be seen here with fiber optic lines that go to each one of the tail lamps. We can tell this is a 1984 or 1985 model by this tufted style interior. This is specifically a 1984 model. You can tell that by this lighter blue cloth interior. 1985 would have a dark blue. This seat design was introduced in 1979 on the Eldorado Biarritz model, and was subsequently promulgated throughout the Cadillac line on the Fleetwood Rome, the Elegance models. It was only introduced on the Seville and only on the base model in 1984. 1985 would share the same style. Prior years used a pleated style seat, definitely a little flatter. While these seats are definitely beautiful, they're not the best wearing seat, especially not in leather. Only in the first 2 years of the Biarritz, of the Eldorado Biarritz model, were these seats available in cloth. And only in a couple of colors. I believe it was just a silver and a baby blue color. However, on the Seville in 1984 and 1985, you could get a cloth interior in this seating style that was not available in the Eldorado. I will say I do prefer the cloth to the leather. I think that the cloth is more comfortable, and of course it does wear a lot better. These seats have a lot of stress points, especially on leather, that cause premature cracking and splitting. The is a revised door panel designed for the base model Seville in 1984. Very rich, expensive door panel. There are no hard plastics on this panel besides the wood, which is not really wood. But we can see here, you have this soft, semi-soft touch vacuum formed stitching on the top pad. An insert which matches the cloth on the seats. Soft touch armrest. 2 lights. And a fully carpeted lower section. What's interesting is when you order the leather interior, in spite of having to pay more for the leather option, this area here was not trimmed in leather. It was trimmed in vinyl. So Cadillac charged a little more and at the same time probably saved a few bucks on the door panels. You can see here that this Seville has an optional digital fuel gauge, digital speedometer and fuel gauge. These cars came standard with a sweep style speedometer that read up to 85 miles an hour. You can see that this car has delay wipers, an optional twilight sentinel, and auto dimming headlights. This car is a somewhat low option Seville. It does not have a power passenger seat. It lacks a seat recliner for the driver's side as well, although you couldn't get a power seat recliner without ordering a power passenger seat. It does have the mid-grade, I would say, stereo. You can see with the graphic equalizer. There was a base model stereo that was only AM/FM. You had this intermediate AM/FM cassette stereo. And for 1983 through 1985, you could get an optional Delco Bose sound system, which would give you speakers on each of the front door panels. And it would actually put delete plates up here in the dash. So all were 4-speaker stereos in this car. You can see here the somewhat small door latch. Interestingly, GM decided to make the lock position for this car forward. You can see it says lock forward. The rear would be unlock. Kind of an odd choice. Figured that where it would say lock, you would think that the door would be locked, and I guess if you thought of this as an up and down one, down would be lock and up would be unlock, but they seem to choose to do it that way. This car has manual, I should say non-power mirrors. These are cable operated. One here for the driver's side, and one here for the passenger side. Power mirrors were available on these cars. You can also see the information centered design. These are just warning lamp housings. This design would be popular for Cadillac. They actually use a basically same design on their 1985 to 1993 C-bodied cars. The interior of this car is fairly roomy. When introduced in 1980, the Seville was actually a 5-passenger car. There was no seatbelt in the middle, front. In 1981, this center area of the seat was actually deleted, and there was a floor console installed in the base model Seville. And then in 1982, this style seat returned, this time with a 3rd belt up front So you could, in theory, I guess, get 3 people in here, and probably it would have to be a really small person. Interestingly enough, these are called 50-45 seats, with the passenger seat being 45 and the driver's seat being 50. And you'll notice that that doesn't add up to 100. These cars, like I said, are pretty narrow. So even when the Eldorado was introduced in 1979, that was actually a 4-passenger car. It didn't even have a center seat belt in the rear seats. Later grow to a 5 and then 6-passenger in 1980 and 1982 respectively. You can see here this totally flat floor, almost totally flat. Slight bump out in the center for the catalytic converter. Check out the rear here. Been treated to the same style door panel. This was also the first Seville, and only Seville, with frameless door glass. Kind of an odd setup here, especially in the rear, where you have this frame section and then frameless section. Like most GM cars, this frameless door glass only goes down about halfway. The door is not physically big enough to retract the full glass into it. And probably to do so, they probably would have had to make this quarter glass really big, and it would look weird. As you can see, here's the rear seat, with the same style seat. You can see the center position with seat belt. Note the reading lamps and the quarter panel. Interestingly, these lights only come on from a switch mounted on them. They don't come on with the door open. So you can see these really are only reading lamps. So all the nighttime illumination is just handled by these lights in the door. Kind of strange. What's interesting about the Eldorado and the Seville is that they don't share, while they do share the same platform and the same type of interior design, they don't share the same dash. While the top panel, this hooded design, is shared between the two cars. The lower panel, the center ashtray, and really this trim piece here, as well as the two ends, are not shared by the two models. The Seville has color-matched plastic sections on each end, whereas the Eldorado used a matching wood tone panel. And on the Eldorado, the ashtray was more disguised and integrated into the bottom panel. So this piece, this vacuum formed, actually I don't know if this is vacuum formed. I think that this may be a type of stitching that was like impregnated into this. It's not sewn, but it's not really a cheap vacuum forming either. This panel would run straight across the bottom here and would slightly dip down here by the driver's section. The ashtray would be integrated into it. As you can see, the Seville has this ashtray door here and a totally different bottom panel. Not sure why they chose to do that. While these cars do share a lot of parts, they're very different in driving aesthetics, and as we can see here, have the large hood out in front of you. The Seville does have flat fenders, whereas the Eldorado had bladed fenders. And they do share the same hood. with the exception of the Seville having this center molding down it. You can see the grab handles here, which were standard on the Seville. It's an interesting Cadillac quirk, I would say, that the cruise control, like many GM cars, is mounted on the turn signal stalk. But it also has this on-off switch on the dashboard. So to turn on the cruise control, you'd reach your desired speed. You would turn on the switch. You would then press the set button here. Or if you wanted to resume a speed after you had hit the brakes and canceled it, you could press resume. Or if the cruise control was still engaged, you could press this to accelerate or hold this to decelerate. Most GM cars, they would have this other switch integrated here into the resume accel feature. I'm not sure why they did this, but Cadillac had done that for many years, and they continued it, I would say, probably from the introduction of cruise control all the way into the 1990s. We can see here an interesting detail on these cars. It's this A-pillar and flush-mounted windshield. I believe this was General Motors' first, well, the Eldorado and Riviera Toronado for 1979, and by extension this car in 1980, had GM's first flush-mounted windshield glass. That is to say that there isn't a large chrome molding here. Helped to cut down a lot on wind noise and endows these cars with a fairly quiet interior cabin. This design kind of made for a strange, and I would say probably hard to execute, area right here. And you have the A-pillar sweeping into the fender, so you have an A-pillar fender gap. Mounted on the top part of the car and on the side. You have an A-pillar to door gap, which is again a compound area, both up and down and front to back. You have, of course, the door to fender, which you have on any design. You come up to the hood here. Of course, have your fender to hood design, common on all cars. Then you have the center cowl here that houses the windshield wipers, which in and of itself has an A-pillar to cowl gap, a cowl to hood. And you have this compound area. You have 4 different gaps coming together. Not easy to execute. Really, this was not an easy to execute car. Something like this would never get approved for production today. So we have to think about vehicles where even the C-pillars, commonly outfitted with a piece of plastic to hide the joint where the C-pillar joins the roof panel. Something like this, again, would never be produced today. This is all lead filler. It fills the C-pillar to roof panel. Of course, the trunk design. So you have this crease that actually runs the length of the car. Runs up across the roof panel. With the Seville having a different design roof than the Eldorado, the Seville roof is basically flat. whereas the Eldorado had a pinch surface here. But they were able to use the same A-pillar design to achieve two totally different styles. Runs down and comes to a compound area, and a big weak spot on these cars is of course the rear fillers. As with most GM cars, the difference with this car, of course, being that you have so many different curves coming together. You have this surface here on the deck lid, on the fender coming down. You have this curved section here. You have another flat area, another curved area, and of course, then the lower part of the filler. And the tail light to contend. This was not an easy thing to achieve. The original filler panels usually fit fairly well. They were of a flexible material. Nowadays, very difficult to achieve a good fit on this. I'm not super happy with the fit on this car. But that's what we have to work with. You can see here the tail lamps that point this to be a 1984 or 1985 model, which have this kind of 3D look that almost looks smoked. The Seville was, I believe, the only GM car that had 3 brake light bulbs. That is to say that there's 3 bulbs that illuminate on each housing when you press the brakes. The original 76 to 79 Seville only had 1 brake light bulb, and those cars honestly are very, very dim from the rear. This car is very bright when you stop, in spite of not having a center high mounted stop lamp. Definitely no mistaking that you're stopping in this car. These taillights are definitely a weak point on the design. Commonly when these cars were in service, people taking things in and out of the trunk, could crack them or other things. They're fairly weak in terms of water intrusion. This car has been garaged its whole life, so you can see that they're still nice and clear, but usually once these sit out in the sun, they haze over or really turn nasty. But it's a nice design. Like I said, 3 stop lamp bulbs per side. They actually necessitated GM using relays in the trunk to power them with their style of turn signal and to not overwhelm the wiring. Go ahead and pop the trunk here. This car does have a power trunk release, which all Sevilles had. Glove box here. See that trunk warning lamp illuminates the information center. Ooh. The trunk is fairly spacious. It's definitely larger than the design would suggest. If you've ever had a 1976 to 79 Seville, you'll know that the trunk is pretty short in terms of overall height. It actually does share the exact trunk floor with the Nova. I wouldn't say that this is bad. You could take this car definitely on a weekend trip. Plenty of cargo storage. You do have this nice carpeted area above and below that's color matched to the interior, with even carpeted hinges. To my knowledge, this was the only regular production GM car that had this type of setup. I believe that the Riviera 20th anniversary edition employed something similar. You can also see here the power pull-down mechanism for the trunk lid. The Space Saver spare tire, again in color matched packing. Speaker housings. Most cars use gas struts to hold the deck lid in place. Kind of not the best design, but it does allow for fairly large opening. Again, you can kind of see there's a bit of a flaw here with the low lift over, but definitely a point where taillights could be damaged. We'll latch this here.